Welcome everybody. This is the GDC replacement seminar that we're holding. Thanks to coronavirus, we obviously can't meet at GDC as we usually would every year. So here at HTC and at Viveport, we have decided to share some of the insights we would normally share at GDC in a series of relatively short, concentrated web sessions. This session is going to be maybe 10 to 15 minutes long. It's kind of a quick introduction to some of the insights we have on game behavior and user behavior. And then after that, we will take questions for probably about 10 or 15 minutes, depending on which ones seem to be interesting to the audience. And then I also want to point out that over the next series of weeks, we have every Tuesday a new session that we're going to release. And we'll release it both as a live seminar during the day, and then we'll also record it and put it up as a video later on tonight. So my name is Bjorn Book-Larsson. I am the head of Viveport. It's the business unit at HTC that is a store and a subscription service for content. And one of the things we realized when we were going through what we might be able to share with the developer community is that we have some insights into how users use our platform that are clearly not available to the individual game developers. So this session is going to be talking mostly about some titles and trends and activities. There's clearly some sensitivities around actual data or real sales numbers and certain types of activities like that, which we can't share. So I'm going to be using as much data as we feel comfortable sharing, and then basically providing in the spoken part of the presentation some insights that we hope developers will incorporate into their future titles. So again, this is the Viveport session talking about content and experiences for VR. So let's see here if we can get it to move over. There we go. So HTC historically has obviously been known as a hardware company. Currently, we have in the market 3 main devices. The original Vive has technically been retired. It still exists as a refurb, but otherwise we are now focused on the Vive Pro I at the high-end professional market or enthusiast market. We have the Vive Cosmos as a consumer PC VR device, and then the Vive Focus, which is an Android-based device. And obviously the development of VR has gone very rapidly and really is a market that's only been around for the last couple of years. The Cosmos is now also coming with different faceplates. The Cosmos design concept is to allow for multiple types of systems and using a single frame. And clearly, as we look into the future, there are going to be more versions of this kind of expandable concepts. The Vive Pro has been decked out over the years with additional features. We now have the Vive Pro I, which includes eye tracking that's integrated into the system. And as we look down the horizon, there's clearly going to be other kinds of ways to make these devices useful for professional use. We have the Vive Focus was one of the very first Android devices on the market. It's now been out for about 2 years. It used a Qualcomm 835 processor. It was sort of a predecessor to the Quest, and it was an entry to the market to explore and see what kind of device would work as an Android system and an Android device. Clearly, this market segment is having a serious amount of development, and obviously with the success of the Quest, we are continuing down the path of development in this area as well. One of the interesting immediate things that's now available to both the Quest and the Focus is to use the PCVR gaming system as a rendering device and then render it to the Android devices. So that's sort of an intermediate step. And the benefit of that, of course, is if you have a Quest and a link cable, you could actually go play the Viveport content as a subscriber. And if you have a Vive Focus, there's a beta version right now of Wi-Fi streaming that lets you stream content from a PC to your Android headset. And again, as we look down the road, we are expecting a lot of evolution and a lot of improvement in these kinds of technologies. And for us, that's very important, given what our focus is as a company. So Viveport is really focused on bringing the best quality experiences we can across any set of hardware. We have had quite a bit of positive feedback. But specifically, what we're trying to get to is to be a relatively agnostic Netflix of VR. And we have specifically designed the service to work well, no matter what type of headset you have. So if you look in the bottom left corner, you'll see, we support the Rift, we support Windows MR, and of course the different Steam VR-based devices, including all the different HTC devices, but also, some of the other devices like Pimax and others can use the service. In the middle, you'll see the devices that are the Android-based systems, and then to the right, in certain markets, especially in China and other places, there's actually a whole series of devices that use a platform that we call the VIVE platform. And the goal from the content team, which is what Viveport really represents, is to build a content ecosystem that can cross all those devices. Today, inside of our content ecosystem on PCVR, we have about 2,600 titles available. And of course, on the Android side, there's between 150 and 200 native titles. And those devices can also, of course, access the PC content. And then over the coming period, we expect to see vast growth in both of the categories, and potentially with the addition of cloud streaming coming down the line as well. So what we wanted to talk about today is specifically that in VR, we see that users spend about 6 hours a month. And this is from an IDC study. This is generally what PlayStation has released about PlayStation VR. It mirrors kind of what we see as well. So, and that compares to general gamers who spend up to 25 hours per month on average in non-VR games. And if you think of your own user pattern, you probably spend about 100 hours a month on your phone. There's different studies, of course, of how much of that is entertainment related and how much of it is just picking up the phone and looking at Facebook. But what it really should give us a little bit of pause around is the fact that VR is a relatively high resistance medium. It's a pretty high barrier to entry, even as the Quest and the Vive Focus are really easy devices to put on. It's still nowhere near as easy as pulling your phone out of your pocket. So in this session, what we wanted to start talking about was that what do we see as a publishing platform that could be maybe useful to know as a game developer, and what kinds of experiences are repeatable and sticky, and what are the personas that use VR and what do they spend the time on. And again, in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to outline some of these data sets. Clearly, what we're going to share is not super detailed data, but at minimum, what I'll be able to do is to share some rankings and some orderings that hopefully gives you guys some good ideas for how to approach the VR development. So when a new subscriber arrives at Viveport, they sign up for the Infinity service, which covers about half our titles today. The first game that people tend to launch is Fruit Ninja. So that may not be a huge surprise because Fruit Ninja exists obviously as an IP on pretty much every type of device and platform out there. And very close second is Angry Birds, same thing, Angry Birds top mobile game. It's a very well-known IP. It's one of the first things that people pick up after they have paid for or activated a subscription. A few others that show up is Richie's Plank, which is a little bit different because it actually is part of often the inbox code with the device when you get it. And then further down the list, you see I Expect You to Die and Gun Club VR. So, and Gun Club is also interesting because often people show up in the service, they become a subscriber, and the first thing they're looking for is something that has a gun. And clearly the name of Gun Club is very appropriate, it's easy to find. But what you don't find in VR today, or at least hasn't yet arrived, have been some of the really big IPs on the gaming side, like Medal of Honor or Call of Duty, hasn't yet arrived. Some of these are in the works, but they haven't arrived yet. So when people show up, it's kind of a moment of exploration where they kind of go around and see what's familiar, and then those are the ones they start playing. Then after you've become familiar with the service, and this is now covering all the titles, and this goes outside of just the subscription titles, this goes to the free titles and the pay-per-play titles or the included promotional titles. The most launched titles on our side is sort of surprising to some people, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about personas. The number one most launched title is Viveport Video. Viveport Video is specialized in 360 videos. It really has two core functions. You could either get top-rated videos from like Red Bull and Discovery Channel, things like Shark Week and others. But you can also download and play your own video content, or you can go search for it. So it's a very frequently launched title. It doesn't mean it's the first thing you do, but as you get into VR, it's a very common thing to do. The next one on the list is the Blue. The Blue has been a staple pretty much since the beginning of the Vive launch itself. Weaver, who has been a great developer for a long time and has come up with some new titles, still turns out that the Blue is a super popular experience to launch. And we'll talk about that again in the persona section when we talk about the person who would like to demo VR for their friends, and that turns out to be a very common use case. And then further down, we have some interesting ones. Mercenary and Fantasy Skiing are very frequently launched, but not necessarily in the US markets. Mercenary is an Asian developed game that has quite frequent usage in certain specific markets. So it stands out because it just the frequency of launches that you have for that particular type of title. And Rich's Plank is very similar to the Blue. Not only is one of the first titles you do play, but it's also a title that you have a lot of demo ability with. And we'll talk about that and again when we talk about the personas. The usage trend for non-gaming content with the longest sessions is actually also interesting. So these experiences are not games. So specifically in this chart, we've taken out games. And these include only game or experiences that have more than 1 hour of user time every single time you start it. So VR sessions tend to be relatively short. They don't tend to be like a PC experience where you can open up a, let's say Microsoft Word and leave it up for hours. They actually tend to be pretty short. So what's these stand out is that they are being used for a very extended period of time. Gravity Sketch is probably the #2 sketch application in VR, but it's the one that has by far the longest use time. The closest competitor, of course, is Google Tilt Brush. Google Tilt Brush has less usage because that's the application or less duration in each use, because that's the application a lot of developers go to, or a lot of users go to when they first get into VR. They want to try something out. They may try Tilt Brush relatively short. Gravity Sketch is something which you often find later. And once you find it, you're probably in a different category or different persona of user. Daily OVR in this one is one of the virtual desktop applications. Exactly why that one has a longer per session use time is not exactly clear to us, but it's an interesting thing to explore. Apollo 17 is actually a pretty recent educational title. It's sort of a cross between a game and an educational experience where you can drive around the lunar surface using a moon buggy. It's quite cool and ends up having very extended use times. And we think actually in some of these cases, like with Apollo 17, we're probably expecting that that title gets extended use from schools and other kinds of experiences. So it may not be actual home users, it might be schools or libraries that have set this up as an experience to showcase things. And then there are some, out of the free titles, there have some future potential in some titles that tend to fall way under the radar. They're not part of the top titles, but they have very long engagement for those users who find them. So one of the ones with the very longest use times is Space Dream Demo. It's from a little independent developer. They have built this pretty cool experience. It's sort of a psychedelic experience of how you can interact with sound and experiences in the space. And it's technically still just a demo. On our site, you can download it. And of course, on Steam, it's available as I think it's still kind of a early access game. And the VR Solar System and then File VR are examples of experiences that have a surprisingly long engagement time for each session. And again, you can look at those as hints toward things that captivate users or leave users in the experience much, much longer than some of the average things out there. So that's some trends that we're currently seeing. The first title you tried to play, the most frequent thing you play once you're actually inside VR and you're kind of used to this experience, and then some hidden things that are under the surface where we don't expect a lot of people to have found these titles. And the goal of Viveport and the Infinity subscription is to try to surface these kinds of things to users so they can go explore them. some of these experiences, because it is very early days in the development cycle, are not fully fleshed out yet. So Space Dream Demo is, as the title says, still technically a demo, but it's a really cool experience that other developers could look at and see what that developer had done right in terms of keeping people captivated. And then we have other categories, which is the most frequent launches per user. And there are, again, in the sort of hidden category games that don't surface because they're big IP or they don't have a big following to begin with, but they have very frequent launches. And often these games have very short play sessions, but they're sticky enough to then cause people to come back to them again and again. So Elven Assassin, Front Defense Heroes, Plank Not Included, which is sort of a spin-off of Rich's Plank, Dick Wild and Rhythm Defender are examples of games that have more frequent launchers than we would expect. And they're sort of surprisingly frequently launched by different players. They don't have maybe as high aggregate play times, but it's one of the metrics, again, as we try to figure out how people use VR. So what I want to share in this section is, again, I apologize ahead of time with not sharing super specific data points, but I do want to talk about, as we look at how these titles get used in the service, we then try to think of personas who actually use these titles and how big of a segment do these personas represent. So we have 4 personas we want to talk about. The first one is what we call the demo guy. And the demo guy, and this is data, of course, we can collect. We can see that they often have a higher end gaming machine. They have a repeat usage every month to demo VR. And the most frequent things that they tend to demo are the Blue, Rich's Plank, Fruit Ninja, and Tilt Brush. Those 4 titles are things that are very easy for users to pull out and show to their friends. Now, those titles that are in the subscription service, if they're very demoable and very easy access, very easy startup, those titles actually end up earning quite a bit of revenue, because over the next 12 months, when this demo guy pulls out his demo and he shows his friends and family and extends it, these titles get activity and play in every month, and therefore they also collect a rev share. So we estimate that something in the 20% range of the audience falls in this category. Also keep in mind that the personas aren't necessarily, there can be overlaps between the personas, and they're obviously not as clean as we present them here. A lot of people do things where they hop between categories, and also people share headsets. So you may have your kids and your parents, so sometimes it's a bit hard to tease these out, but these are the trends we're noticing. The second category is the casual gamer. They tend to have more of a mid-spec machine, and they have repeated usage of casual games. So unlike the demo guy who sort of runs through a certain category of games, this person has certain types of casual games that get repeated all the time. So, and they tend to be a longer-term subscriber. They play games like Angry Birds, I Expect You to Die, and Virtual Sports. And then from our side, it's an interesting one to look at, because again, they contribute to the subscription revenues, because the goal for that user is an experience that can be repeated frequently or also to some extent demoed. For all of you who have played I Expect You to Die, it's probably one of the best put together, seeded or relatively low impact VR experiences. And it's also very, very well done. One of the insights we came up with as well was, as we look at how people interact with content, for instance, the different rhythm games, and in this particular setup, since we're focused on the subscription side, we haven't included Beat Saber and a few others which aren't in the subscription. But when we look at user behavior across those games, another trend emerges, which is that people don't really want to sweat, especially not the people who are in the casual category. Or if they sweat, you want to sweat just enough. So Fruit Ninja can be a little bit of a vigorous workout. Beat Saber can be a workout, but there's some other rhythm games that are truly workout. And what we see is the more you add as a user interface where you have to work harder and harder, the more likely it is that that user is actually going to be less and less likely to return. So there's a fine trade-off between trying to make an interesting control system for VR and then not make it so invigorating or so complicated or so difficult to use that basically it's too strenuous. So if we go back to when we talked about usage time, VR is still a relatively high hurdle to get into every single time you're going to put on a headset. So if you have a usage scheme that is a lot of work, there's a good chance that people will repeat it less. At the same time, the right balance has to be something that exploits the fact that this is VR. So this is a tricky design balance, but if you look at the top titles in these categories that targets the casual gamer, so the Fruit Ninjas, the Angry Birds, I Expect You to Die, these kind of games, they're really good inspirations for good control schemes that doesn't require too much effort. So this is about 20% of the audience in our estimate. Another category is the creator and explorer. So often they have a high-end workstation, they're very focused on specific applications, and they often have repeated usage. So this particular category don't play many games, but actually switch between Gravity Sketch and Tilt Brush, for example, or different educational programs. It's hard for us to determine if this is in, let's say, offices or schools in many cases, but it's a very dedicated user who actually will stay subscribed to the subscription portion or stay active if they have purchased titles for a longer period of time than most of the other categories. And we know that there are some companies like in car design and others that use some of these tools on a professional setting as well. So this is where both home users and professional users have a bit of overlap. We think there's about a 10% audience for this category who are in the sort of hardcore. And of course, people have been using Tilt Brush and some of these other tools outside the category, but the persona itself, if you have a top title for this persona, then that title can have a very, very long usage time. And again, in a subscription service, continue to basically generate revenues for a very long period of time. And then the final category, which is not the surprising one, which we put it last, is the hardcore gamer. Generally speaking, tends to have the highest end gaming machine of them all, and have repeated plays of Gun Club, Super Hop, Sariento, Arizona Sunshine. And there's some few interesting moments here. So on the bottom left, you'll see there's a graph, which may not be that easy to come through in this seminar, but that actually tells you that if you start your journey at Gun Club, then the next title you then move to tends to be Super Hot and Sorrento and Arizona Sunshine. And you can see small arrows going to Fruit Ninja, to Rush, or to other kinds of games like I Expect You to Die, but they're not that big. So people move around, but people who come in as a hardcore gamer tend to stay in the hardcore gamer category. And one of the insights we wanted to give the developer audience is that even though the hardcore gamer is the larger audience portion, around 25% of the users here in these personas, the competition for free or first-person shooters is quite high. So there's quite a bit of high-quality first-person shooters, high-quality shooters with a zombie element or horror element. So if you are developing games right now, you may want to consider games that are sticky and long-term repeatable, and potentially not in the most high-intensity competition category. So let's see here if we have the session. Yep, there we go, just all. So for the developers, things we also wanted to share was that people who are in the Infinity category, which is the subscription service, they spend an average of about 5 hours a month on Infinity, consuming content that's inside the service, and then they spend some time outside of that as well. Out of that, developers get 80% revenue share, and generally you end up earning about 2 times more revenue per subscribers than non-subscribers. And that has more to do with the length of the subscription itself. So we launched the service in April, about 2 years ago now. And basically what has happened is we can now see the long tail effects. So in classical game development and game publishing, you tend to want to sell the game up front, and then to some extent, you're kind of away from the user. You even see a lot of cases where people buy a game on, let's say, Steam, they put it in the library, they never actually play the game. Subscription is a bit different. You actually have to get the people engaged and play it, and upfront you get paid much less because, of course, in the first month of usage, the usage numbers won't ever be that big on a per unit basis. But the difference is now that some of these titles have been around for a very long time, like the Blue is still a very top performing title across all these different categories, even years later. And those titles can then generate revenues in a service like this for a very, very long time. Same thing with Tilt Brush and other kinds of games or experiences. Geography of the Infinity members is about half of it is in the US, and then the rest sort of breaks down. The next biggest market is China, and then Europe accounts in total for about 35%. And then there is sort of the other parts of Australia and New Zealand section is also relatively active in VR, and also APAC. So I think our insights that we wanted to share today was that the casual gamer is somebody that you probably want to continue to target. And the question is just how can you make it recurring gameplay? How can it be a puzzle that can come back to month after month? And if you do that, make sure that your designed control scheme is not too tiring. Because if you have a control scheme that takes a lot of effort, a lot of big movements, you tend to have a drop in repeatability and repeat usage. The thing to always keep in mind is that to put on a VR headset still has a big startup cost, a big hurdle. And there you want to make sure that your mechanics are not overly complicated while still being really good and VR centric. And then the most replay occurs in the creators category. The category is smaller than the others, but the usage is intense. So if you designed a gravity sketch or a tilt brush kind of application, there's a very good chance that you have a massive amount of repeat over a long period of time. And you should think about that too when you design your business model around those kinds of titles. Do you want to have a title that can come back month after month and generate long-term revenues? Do you want to have something that's sold for a license up front? How do you want to actually interact with the end user? So I think from our side, we also are anticipating the streaming VR experiences that are coming. Obviously 5G is around the corner. There are some initial stream inside your home that's happening today between PC and Android headsets. Obviously those are moving outside the home. NVIDIA is very early with some of their streaming for PC games, and clearly that's going to expand into VR and other experiences. And as the market grows, we expect more and more of this kind of split experience components where you can render on the local device, maybe a lesser experience, and then you can get the full-blown, full effect, massive experience rendering it off the cloud. So this is obviously stuff coming in the future. And that is it. We wanted to share a little bit of insights into some trends we have seen over the last 2 years as a platform subscription service. And we hope that you have enjoyed this brief introduction seminar and that you'll come back every Tuesday as we have follow-on seminars that focuses on different aspects of the VR development chain. With that, we will take some questions. The way that you take the questions is you should have a chat box that's available to you. And you can ask the questions in that chat box, and I will answer them verbally in this seminar. Oh, so the first question is from Pizarro. It is, how did you come up with the personas? We had just looked at the user data and basically tried to slice the data components based on usage. So when we started seeing clusters of activity, this goes back to that little chart we were showing you of how Gun Club relates to Sorrento, relates to these others. We see that certain types of users cluster within a certain group of titles. And then of course there's crossovers. Some people who are hardcore gamers end up playing a lot of Angry Birds too. But to the best of our ability, we sort of then slice them up based on the kinds of games that they keep coming back to. And those 4 were the big one that stood out. There's obviously dozens of these personas with varying amounts of overlap. Okay. Let's see if we have any other questions. Let's see. We may have a technical slowdown here on some of the questions coming in. So we have a few. Next question was, are there any differences in retention in each type of persona? Yes is the answer. And again, the most retaining persona is the ones who use tilt brush and gravity sketch. Those tend to be retained the longest. If I remember correctly off the data, the casual gamer is actually the second most retained, and then the hardcore gamer is the third. Now, there is differences. Now, of course, they shift pretty dramatically as new titles get introduced. We expect the introduction of Half-Life Alyx to have a whole change in how people interact with these games, just as some of these new early stage things have happened as well. Are you developing VR arcade software? Yes, there's actually VR arcade software. Of course, with the coronavirus, arcades is not probably the strongest market to be in at the moment. You can go to Viveport Arcade if you just look it up on the Vive website. That's an arcade management solution where you can then grant users a commercial license and you can play by the minute or by the month. And it's very similar to the arcade programs from some other providers. We are continuing to explore that because a lot of people have not seen VR yet, and very often the first place they come across VR is actually in the mall or in sort of a location, and then they'll go home and continue using VR. So we're excited about the VR arcade size. All right, so we got more users. Now we get lots of questions coming in. Yeah, so next question is from Blake. Were you able to identify users that appear to be LBE centers, and were the different behavior patterns for those? There were. So for example, you saw in one of the lists earlier, we had talked about the game Mercenary. It mostly appears in some of the APAC markets, and we expect that some of those usage numbers actually are from LBEs, potentially using a consumer license in those LBEs. But in most cases, we've been pretty good at segmenting it over, and none of this data here, by the way, shows the LBE usage that we have in the formal Viveport Arcade LBE software. And that's a different piece of software that lets you then download and manage content for LBEs. So we don't actually see that much inside the consumer software side. There's a couple of them for specific markets, but generally the Western markets are pretty well segregated between consumer and arcade using two different software sets. The next question from Meftahi. Are you planning to integrate Arabic users? Yes, we have. There is technically ability to play in some countries, for instance, United Arab Emirates, as far as I recall. We even have some demo centers in UAE. Most games don't have good language support for Arabic, but often they have language support for English, and then after that, that's usually the sort of 6 largest languages. But developers today can technically upload content that works for those markets. There just isn't that much content yet. Conrad's asking, is the data based purely on 6DoF systems that have tracked controllers, or are there also 3DoF systems used? There's not much 3DoF. So our data here is basically focused on the devices we supported or the sort of second generation devices. So for example, the Quest being used as a Rift playing Infinity titles would show up in this data. However, it wouldn't show any data from something like the Oculus Go or other kinds of lower-end 3DoF devices. We do have some of those that use our Wave ecosystem, specifically in some markets. Those often show up just as video plays or video content. So our Viveport Video Player exists both for 3DoF, 6DoF, Android, and PC. We'll see a lot of usage for those applications. But for most of the games and experiences here, we're talking almost exclusively 3DoF. I mean, sorry, exclusively 6DoF, not 3DoF. Next question for Christian was, regarding the 6 hours per month for VR users, could this be attributed to the vertigo experience that users may have? Potentially. The research is still early. We expect that 15 to 20% of VR users have an issue with motion sickness and vertigo, and it just doesn't work well for a segment of the population. So yes, but the 6 hours that we think is also related to the fact that VR is still pretty complicated to just simply put on. And even if you buy an integrated AIO device, it's still pretty complicated to put it on and get it started. And it's, at some point it's going to get easy, cheap, fast, all those things. And then I think usage will continue to tick up. And that's what we're seeing too as new devices get launched. They all have improvements. and they end up having basically easier access. From what you've seen, how much does price affect the groups you mentioned? That's a question from Travis. That's a good question. I don't know if you refer to the price for hardware, price on the software, but on the hardware side, of course, people who spend significant amounts of money on the hardware tend to play a slightly different category of games and content. So if you spend $1,200 on professional set headset, you're more likely to use some of the creator tools or play hardcore first-person shooters. From the software side, obviously Infinity as a subscription service gives quite good value to the end users. So you end up with more exploration. So people who are Infinity subscribers tend to use more content because they go around and explore it, and they also tend to find kind of the hidden gems. People who pay per title tend to focus on buying known quantities. So they'll sort of pay for something they know and not really go around and explore so much. What category is most used by users? Depends what we mean by category, but probably the biggest user group is still going to be the hardcore gamer. Jochen asks, how does cinematic VR perform in comparison to VR games? And how do interactive storytellers like Gloomy Eyes perform? Do you see any increase in social or multi-user games? Okay, that's multiple questions. Yeah, so starting with the last question first, VR chat is a good example. It's one of the most successful sort of social VR experiences. And for full disclosure, I'm on the board of VR chat. It's a very exciting little company. They have been able to expand VR outside of just VR users. So what's fascinating about it is you can download and play VR chat without a headset. So it actually reaches what we call the VR curious. And I think in some previous talks, we had talked about how one of the challenges for VR is that not that many people have seen what you can do with it. So it's actually a great idea when you design your content in your game to rope in people who are not in VR. And VR chat's a great example of having done that successfully. There's been about 30 or so social VR platforms, and it's one of the few that really went after that from the very beginning, and for the past 2 years have grown that. And then going back to cinematic VR, cinematic VR is something you often see more on 3D or 3DOF headsets. You don't necessarily see the retention when that's the experience you have. And cinematic VR also doesn't generate the revenues that actual game experiences have. Next question from, let's see here. Let's see, what else we got? Do you see any increase in social multi-user games? We got that from Aaron. Thomas is asking, are you using the likelihood of titles played by personas to recommendations? The answer is yes. So basically, if a certain player has played certain activities, we'll obviously recommend other titles similar to that. Travis is asking, how does the title's price affect retention? For example, $6 Half-Life Alyx versus $15 Tilt Brush. That gets a bit complicated. There is a theory that if you spend more on a title, you will actually stay longer. We can't really confirm or deny that. It often comes back to the, some of the titles you get for free with a box, in many cases, like the Blue or Rich's Plank, actually have some of the best retention because, again, it goes under that demo persona. What we also see is that some of the expensive titles, also may have a situation where people buy them but don't necessarily play them or play through them. So it's not always a one-to-one relationship. Now, what's going to happen is unless you have a title that has really strong IP, it's very unlikely that people will fork out that kind of money up front. Alyx is clearly a fantastic game. We hope it has a strong positive impact on the VR market. But it's, remains to be seen if it's going to be more retaining than, let's say, Fruit Ninja. Like it may not in terms of just ongoing activity. Once you've gone through the game, even though it's massive, you might go back to play Fruit Ninja. Let's see here. Next question from Nicholas. Why is Europe less present in the field of VR? What are the improvements that could change that? Europe is pretty prominent. It's about 35 to 40% of the VR market. Some countries like Germany are very prominent in VR. It's just that Europe, of course, isn't just one country. Like US, Canada sort of has one cultural and language component. We're 28 countries in Europe, so it always makes it a little more fragmented. You may have a game that's optimized for a specific language and it doesn't present so well in maybe some others. So I think Europe is actually quite on the forefront. There are some companies that have explored, for instance, virtual shopping in Europe that's ahead of what was done in the US. And those have been kind of interesting systems. There's also some really great arcade systems that came out of Europe that were built both for sort of location-based entertainment and some mechanisms for arcades. They're very prominent out of Europe. Sandro is, do you have trends between personas and lineup? Yes. So, clearly the highest end hardware drives the users who are much more focused on creating tools. So the create persona is much more likely to also have a Vive Pro I or other high-end hardware. And then let's see here. Let's see. Catherine is asking, what will be done in the next 5 to 7 years to adopt a larger casual gaming crowd? I think the casual gaming crowd is actually already surprisingly large for the number of headsets in the market. I think what's really going to happen is as the headsets gets cheaper, lighter, more powerful, that is when that market will effectively kind of explode. We think there's going to be a tipping point, and clearly there are some hardware makers waiting in the wings. The rumor has been that Apple has a device ready to go sometime in 2022 or 2023. That could be a really interesting improvement for the whole market. And for us as a company, we're excited to see it because fundamentally we just want to grow this type of interface for everybody. But I think the answer is really going to be faster, cheaper, lighter, more powerful, better ergonomic devices are coming out, and each iteration and each generation makes it better. And what ends up happening then is you have more and more casual users will get into it. And then Conrad has a question of, is there data about the age of the players? The answer is sort of. VR games often don't fall under the ESRB guidelines. They sort of live in their own weird vacuum. And what you end up with is, we still follow them. So we collect age data for certain titles, but there is a large user set where we don't have any age data for them. So in those cases, no, but for some sets of the audience, we clearly can see how many users we have in different categories. So Christian Lopez is asking, this may be outside the scope of the webinar, but has there been a comparison of VR versus AR? Actually, there's quite a bit of it. If you go to SuperData, you can go look at the VR AR growth. They have some free charts on their site. SuperData is a subsidiary of Nielsen. They're actually really good for getting this kind of data sets. AR, technically speaking, depending on what you mean by it, can be considered enormous already. Clearly Pokemon Go is, a great example of AR. Niantic has built some really great AR style content that exists today already. But if you mean what we would call XR, which is more like a fully immersive environment that incorporates both virtual and real, then that's clearly very nascent, much earlier than VR almost, and has the potential to grow much bigger. For the Cosmos, we released something called the XR Plate to have high resolution imagery go inside the headset. And obviously that kind of enclosed, fully immersed XR is going to grow tremendously. But for pure intents like AR on a phone is already very, very big. The question was, does VR arcade make sense if hardware becomes lighter and better and presumably cheaper? Probably. There's things you can do in an arcade setting that you really can't do at home. It's hard to have 4 headsets at your house to play kind of a 4-person co-op. It's hard to have a motion share or a racing car or kind of a motion platform. Some of those kind of systems tend to cost $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 depending on what you're doing. So I think for a fully immersed experience, arcades are really fantastic. In the West Coast in the US, there's several companies that have been building out these kind of family entertainment centers. 2-Bit Circus is probably the best example. That's a very sort of interactive amusement or playground type thing for all ages, and it's done really well experimenting between immersion, arcades, and sort of traditional physical games. And then, of course, you have the Void and large installations that do really great, and again, lets you go through spaces that you simply don't have in your house. So I think the physical experience in an arcade can be really, really great, and we just have to wait and see as more spaces get built out. Okay, I think those are all the questions we're going to have time for today. If you guys want to see a replay of the seminar, we should be able to post that later on tonight. Come back every Tuesday. We're going to have these type of sessions for the next several weeks, and you can find it on our website. Actually, in a blog post on Viveport, you can see the next set of sessions. And again, huge thanks from everyone who participated. Thank you for your questions, and we will be able to talk to you in the near future. Thanks.